Good day. In order to understand the history of minority, oppressed peoples, etc., it is an extremely difficult task. What we can, however, do is do a form of interpretive, historical, sociological analysis of the period that we're interested in. In my case, I'm interested in a better understanding of the societies of the Western Cape and the peoples of the Western Cape during the early period from 1600s through the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. And how do I do that, since there's very little textual history available to do this interpretation and analysis? Well, one is I can look at travelogues, which I've done. I can study the history of other peoples in the region at the time who leave texts, and that I've done and I'm still doing. And in this case, I'm trying to understand, for example, the history of Islam at the Western Cape and Cape Town during the early period, 1600s, 1700s. So mostly from the time of Jan van Riebeeck, since we know that's when many of the early people come from from Malaysia, Indonesia, that region of the world, Bangladesh, and the islands on the coastlines. So certainly we start from that period, 1652 onwards, and it is through the Dutch Reform text and history that I'm able to do an interpretive understanding of how the people, they engage, how they practice their religions, and how they are able to create their realities. I have access, for example, to the Dutch Reform records. I have access to the French Huguenot records. I have access to the German Lutherans, since these are the major European groupings who arrived during that period and have some sort of text and histories that I can go through and try and make sense of. So I've done a little bit of a lecture on the French Huguenots in the past. I've done something on the early Dutch Reform religion. And today I'm going to do a little insight or take a walk through the early German Lutheran history. And it is through an interpretation of how these people are treated that you develop a sense of how other people could possibly have been treated during that period. So, for example, if the German Lutherans, as a significant percentage of the early white settler community that arrives at the Cape, let's say 30%, many of them coming from Scandinavian regions and what we know of today as Germany, if they are not allowed to practice their religion, they're not allowed to build their own church in the first 100 years since the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck from 1652 forward. That must give you an understanding of how difficult it had to be for other people to create religious spaces and to build their churches or religious institutions. We know, for example, that Islam builds its first mosque around about the early 1800s. So just at the turn of the century. Why is that? And maybe if I go through some of these other groupings and see how difficult it is for them to build a church and what they have to go through and why they have to go through those difficulties, it gives you a sense of how difficult it is for Islam and for Hinduism and for Buddhism and for all those other religious minority groupings to build their religious spaces. Islam is important because it is one of the bigger groupings at the Cape at the time. In fact, some historians point out that by 1820, about 50% of the population of Cape Town is Muslim. So let's not waste time and let's start with the German Lutherans. So the German Lutherans they are the third group of Europeans who contributed significantly to the formation of the early white settler population coming from Germany and some Scandinavian regions. Now, these immigrants were mostly single men. They arrived at the Cape as sailors employed by the VOC, but were mostly of Lutheran persuasion. And since the VOC's initial intention was to build, as I mentioned before in a previous lecture, was to build a supply station at the Cape and not to invest in the development financially of a future colony, the religious affiliation of the Germans was not of primary concern to the VOC administration when they initiated their refreshment station, their project in 1652. The historian Dr. J. Hoge has stated that already at the Union of Utrecht, the treaty signed on the 23rd of January in 1579, almost 100 years earlier, at that treaty unified the northern provinces of the Netherlands in Europe. It was determined there already that no other religion besides that of the Reformed tradition would be allowed in their republic. Hence, what we're arguing here is that that attitude is transplanted to the Cape when the VOC arrives there. However, he notes that while this might have been the case in theory, in practice over time, tolerance was exercised, especially with regards to the Lutheran Church. The religious tolerance found in the Netherlands between the Reformed Church and Lutheranism was transplanted to the Cape during the early years. Very soon after landing at the Cape, the VOC had to consider the religious needs of the significant percentage of German Lutherans in their employ. And my previous researches show that this was roughly about 30% of the early European settler community. Hoge says, and written in Afrikaans, dat reeds die eerste kerkraad onder die leiding van die eerste permanente predikant van die Kaap, Johan van Arkel, het in 1665, die jaar van laasgenoemde se aankoms, besluit om Lutherane tot die nagmaal in die gereformeerde kerk toe te laat, as hulle daarom sou aansoek doen en van 'n onberispelike karakter was. Now that's very important. They had to apply, as the Afrikaans suggests, and they had to be under the guidance of the Dutch Reform Minister, but most importantly, they had to be of unquestionable character. So these were important features in their access to the Dutch Reformed Church services, not Lutheran services. There were no Lutheran churches. So it is evident that, as was the case in the Netherlands, the Reformed Church at the Cape was tolerant toward the Lutherans, as long as they seemed to be of good character. However, this tolerance was exercised within the Reformed Church and under the conditions of the authority of the Reformed clergy, as most decisions regarding religious matters at the time were managed by the presiding ministers at the Cape. Thus, Lutheran settlers and their descendants had opportunity to serve their God, albeit in the Reformed Church. They were free to partake in the Eucharist ceremony within the Reformed Church, and we know during that period, 1600s, the Eucharist was an important component of Christian ritual and theology. So very important for them to do so, but yet again within the Reformed Church. And some of them, as he suggests, did. The historian Hoge points out that some Lutheran fathers allowed their children to be baptized, and in the history of Christianity, baptism is the key ritual, key feature within that tradition for centuries. So even during the 1600s, the ritual of baptism must have been foremost on the minds of those Christian Lutheran parents wanting their children to be baptized as Christians, and again here within the Reformed Church. But they tried to maintain a Lutheran identity, according to this historian. However, he is of the opinion that the majority did not take advantage of the opportunities afforded them, and in fact speaks of the religious carelessness of the German Lutherans. And if we go back to the Afrikaans language and what he says, he would say, dit lyk echter asof die Lutherane, die meeste van hulle van Duitsers, was Duitsers, van hierdie vergunning maar min gebruik gemaak het. So what is literally translated is suggesting that these Lutheran parents did not really partake or make use of this opportunity to use the facilities of the Dutch Reformed Church. So the early Lutherans that arrived, the need to have an independent church surfaced openly. The Reformed Church successfully opposed the request to have an independent church for another 50 years. So from 1652 to 1730, there's no Lutheran church. It was only in 1780, after many attempts, that the Lutherans were finally granted the right to establish their first church. What are we saying here? That even the European Christians and the Christian churches like Lutheranism, who arrive at the Cape with Van Riebeeck and his Zacharias Wagenaar and those commanders after Van Riebeeck, they were not allowed, even though they made up 30% and more of the sailor population, they were not allowed to have their own church outside of the Reformed tradition. However, it appears that already before then many settlers had accepted the idea that the Cape was an exclusive Reformed religious public space, including a significant number of those of Lutheran persuasion. In the end, most Germans assimilated into the Dutch Reformed Church, either, mostly I would argue, through marriage to women belonging to the Dutch Reformed Church, or by having their children baptized in the Dutch Reformed Church. The successful commitment of the authorities to disallow other churches the right of public worship before 1780, even those that were also of Protestant persuasion, you could argue, thus meant that the Dutch Reformed Church had ample time in which to cement its teachings amongst the early white settler community at the Cape. And we know key among these were its ideas of being predestined, predestination, signs of election, and of course one's calling, beroof, in other words. The actions of the Dutch Reformed elite in maintaining religious exclusivity for such a long period, let's say 130 years, can be explained as an almost, you could say, an emotional, an effectual type of behavior, because their decision to prevent the Lutherans from building their own church, even though they needed satisfied settlers for labor, favors the argument that commitment to religion, or the Dutch Reformed religion in this case, outweighed any rational decision making where Lutheran communities could have been more productive. So this is an important understanding that in that period, emotion in terms of decision making outweighs instrumental rationality. It is all about the church. So the above discussion makes it clear that the influence of the Dutch Reformed Church reached beyond the French Huguenots and early Dutch settlers. This exclusive religious space was very significant because it fostered a social environment where Calvinist routine, including behavior related to work, I've done lots of research on that, and attitudes in general, could cement roots. Any scholarship on religion, Islam, Christianity, or Afrikaner history that challenges the relevance of the Dutch Reformed Church's doctrines, including those of predestination, election, etc., has to argue away the social significance of the commitment of the Dutch Reformed Church to maintaining its exclusive religious space at the Cape in this formative period. So I hope this gives us some indication as to why some of the other religions had such difficulty in creating religious spaces for their communities. not even those European brothers who came with them from other Protestant Christian religious formations were not allowed the opportunities to build their churches. And even in the case of the Lutherans, it took almost 130 years before they were allowed to build their first church. We know about 20 years later, Islam is allowed to build its first mosque. So we'll chat and we'll investigate further at another lecture. Thanks.